A man who buried his name with his wife could still be undone by the simple need for a hot meal. And so Jacob hammered a crude wooden sign into the frozen earth that said all that was left to say. Cook meated. The wind, a bitter and constant predator in this high Wyoming valley, tore at the letters as if trying to erase the request, to leave him to the cold solitude he had earned. His ranch was a lonely outpost, a scar of timber and stone against the endless, unforgiving white of winter. The mountains stood like silent, hooded judges around him, their peaks lost in a perpetual shroud of gray cloud. For 2 years, the only warmth in his cabin had come from the stone hearth, a greedy mouth that devoured wood but gave back no comfort. And the only company was the phantom weight of memory, a ghost that sat in his wife's empty chair and watched him with hollow eyes. He had forgotten the sound of another person's breath in the quiet hours before dawn, the simple scent of another living soul. He was a man whittled down to bone and regret, his heart a frozen river that no spring seemed capable of thawing. The sign was a concession not to hope, but to the gnawing emptiness in his belly and the weary ache in his bones from another meal of dry tack and half-frozen salted meat. He expected no one. The nearest town was a 2-day ride in good weather, and this was the cruelest heart of winter. He expected the sign to be buried by the next drift, a futile prayer swallowed by the indifferent snow. So when he saw the figure, a smudge of impossible color against the blinding canvas of the landscape, he thought it was a trick of the light, his mind finally fracturing under the immense pressure of the silence. But the smudge grew, resolving itself into the shape of a girl, small and impossibly fragile, walking directly toward his cabin. She wore a dress the color of a fading sunset, a pale, tattered pink that had no place in this world of gray and white. As she drew closer, he saw that she had no coat, no shawl, and most astonishingly, no shoes. Her feet, blue with cold, were bare upon the snow. She was Chinese, her face a mask of exhaustion, her dark eyes holding the vast, haunted emptiness of the land she had just crossed. She stopped before the sign, her gaze tracing the rough letters, and then she lifted her eyes to him, standing on his porch, a hulking shadow against the gray light. She did not speak. She simply stood there, a question and an answer all at once, shivering not from the cold, but from a deeper, more profound exhaustion that seemed to emanate from her very soul. Jacob's first instinct, the one honed by years of violence and loss, was to send her away. She was trouble. She was a stray, and strays brought attachments, and attachments brought pain. He had no room for more pain. He opened his mouth to speak the harsh words, to tell her to move on, that there was nothing for her here. But the words caught in his throat, frozen by the sight of her bare feet sinking into the snow. It was an act of such desperate, suicidal hope to walk into a Wyoming winter with nothing, that it broke through the thick ice of his apathy. He saw not a stranger, but a reflection of his own brokenness, another soul pushed to the absolute edge of the world. He gave a curt, angry jerk of his head toward the cabin door. "Inside," he growled, the word a plume of white in the frigid air, the sound of it foreign and jarring in the profound silence he had cultivated for so long. He had posted for a cook, but what had arrived was a ghost, and he had just invited her in. He watched her as she crossed the threshold, her movements stiff with cold but imbued with a strange, fluid grace. She left a trail of melting snow on the rough-hewn floorboards, small, perfect footprints that seemed to accuse the cabin of its own coldness. The space was stark, brutally functional, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and the metallic tang of loneliness. A narrow cot, a rough table with 2 chairs, one of which remained perpetually empty, and the great stone hearth that dominated the room. There was no softness here, no curtain on the single window, no rug on the floor. It was a place a man came to disappear, not to live. She stood in the center of the room, her small frame dwarfed by the heavy log walls, her hands clasped before her. The tattered pink cheongsam she wore was made of thin silk, a garment for a warmer world, for a life unimaginably distant from this frozen wasteland. Its edges were frayed, and a long dark stain marred the fabric near the hem, but she wore it with a kind of innate dignity that defied her circumstances. Jacob said nothing more, merely pointing a calloused finger toward the cast-iron stove. It was a gesture of command, a test. He expected her to falter, to confess she could not read the sign, that she was just seeking shelter. He half hoped she would, giving him a reason to cast her back out into the snow before she could take root. But she simply looked at the stove, then at the meager stack of provisions against the far wall, a sack of flour, a half-empty crate of potatoes, a slab of salt pork hanging from a hook. Her gaze was quick, assessing. She gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then, without a word, she moved. Her silence was not empty. It was dense, filled with an unspoken history. She went first to the water bucket, her hands moving with an economy that spoke of long practice. She washed them, the icy water a shock he knew she must feel, but her expression remained unchanged. She then approached the provisions, her touch on the rough flour sack gentle, respectful. She seemed to be listening to the ingredients, divining their potential. Jacob retreated to his chair by the fire, the one that did not belong to his wife's memory, and watched her, his wariness a physical presence in the room. He was a man who understood the language of violence, of survival, but this quiet, methodical ritual of creation was foreign to him. He watched her peel the potatoes with a small knife she produced from a hidden pocket in her dress, the blade worn but sharp. Her fingers, though numb with cold, were deft and sure. She stoked the fire in the stove, her movements precise, coaxing a steady, even heat from the wood. Soon the air, once thin and sharp, began to thicken with the scent of frying salt pork and onions. It was a smell from another life, a lifetime ago. It was the scent of home, and its sudden presence in this hollow shell of a cabin was a violation, a trespass against the sterile sanctuary of his grief. He felt a knot tighten in his chest, a strange and unwelcome mixture of anger and a longing so sharp it was akin to physical pain. He had wanted a cook to fill his belly, not to fill his house with ghosts of warmth and comfort he had long since sworn off. The meal she prepared was a miracle born of scarcity. From potatoes, flour, salt pork, and a few wild onions he'd forgotten were drying by the hearth, she created a thick, savory stew in a small stack of skillet flatbread, golden brown and fragrant. The aroma filled every corner of the cabin, a warm, living thing that pushed back against the cold seeping through the walls and the deeper chill emanating from his own heart. She served him first, placing a steaming bowl on the table before him without a word, her eyes downcast. Her movements were a study in unobtrusive service, as if she were trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. Jacob stared at the stew. Steam rose from it in gentle curls, carrying the scent of nourishment, of life. It had been years since anyone had cooked for him, years since a meal had been anything more than a grim necessity to be choked down. He picked up the spoon, the metal cold against his fingers, and took the first bite. The warmth spread through him instantly, a liquid fire chasing away the internal frost. It was more than just food. It was a craft, an act of transformation. The simple ingredients were elevated, the flavors balanced, the texture perfect. He ate the entire bowl without stopping, the silence of the room broken only by the scrape of his spoon against the wood. When he was finished, he looked up at her. She stood by the stove, her back to him, waiting. She had not served herself. He cleared his throat, the sound rough from disuse. "There's more." It was not a question. He ladled another portion for himself, and then, after a moment's hesitation, filled a second bowl and pushed it across the table toward the empty chair. It was an invitation, and it felt like a betrayal of the ghost who resided there. The girl turned, her dark eyes flickering to the bowl, then to his face. She hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features, before she moved to the table and sat, perching on the very edge of the chair as if ready to flee at any moment. They ate in a shared, profound silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. The food was a bridge between them, a language they could both understand. When they were done, he rose and went to an old sea chest that held the last remaining remnants of his wife's life. He pulled out a pair of worn leather boots. They were small for a man, but would be far too large for the girl. They were scuffed and the leather was cracked, but they were sturdy and lined with wool. He placed them on the hearth, close to the fire, and said nothing. He did not look at her. It was not a gift, he told himself. It was a practical matter. He could not have a person dying of frostbite on his floor. But as he sat back down and watched the firelight play over the worn leather, he knew it was a lie. It was his first offering, his first crack in the wall of ice he had so carefully constructed around himself. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm, as steady and predictable as the slow, relentless march of winter. Jacob would rise before the sun, the cold air a familiar shock to his system, and find the girl, he still did not know her name and had not asked, already awake. A low fire would be glowing in the stove, and the scent of coffee, a luxury he rarely bothered with for himself, would be hanging in the air. He would pull on his heavy coat and venture out into the biting cold to tend his meager stock, his breath pluming in the pre-dawn gloom. He spent his days in the harsh embrace of the outdoors, the physical labor a necessary anesthetic for the dull ache in his soul. He repaired fences that groaned under the weight of the snow, chopped firewood until his muscles screamed in protest, and shoveled paths from the cabin to the barn, a constant battle against the encroaching drifts. The wind was his constant companion, its mournful howl a fitting soundtrack to his self-imposed exile. Yet, something had changed. When he returned to the cabin at dusk, beaten down by the cold and the labor, he was no longer met with a dead, silent space. He was met with warmth. The cabin, once a hollow tomb, now felt like a refuge. The girl, whose name he had decided in his own mind was An Lee, though he never spoke it, had transformed the space through her quiet, persistent presence. The floors were swept clean, his dusty blankets were folded neatly on his cot, and there was always a pot of something simmering on the stove, its savory aroma a welcome that went deeper than words. He noticed the small things, the subtle shifts. A small bundle of dried winter herbs tied with a bit of twine hanging from a ceiling beam. The single window, once caked with grime, was now clean, letting in the pale, precious winter light. One day he came in to find a small, intricate knot she had tied from a piece of discarded rope, hanging on a nail by the door. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a small, perfect piece of order in a world of chaos. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a silent ballet of gestures and offerings. He would leave a brace of rabbits on the porch, and they would appear that evening in a rich, dark stew. He brought in a sack of apples he had stored in the cellar, and the next day the cabin was filled with the sweet, nostalgic scent of them baking with cinnamon. In return for his provision, she provided not just food, but care. She took his worn, torn shirt one evening while he slept, and using a needle and thread he had left on the table, mended it with tiny, all but invisible stitches. When he saw it the next morning, neatly folded, he felt a strange tightening in his throat. He had not known such gentle care since his wife Sarah had been alive. He found the boots he had left by the fire were now hers. She had stuffed them with rags to make them fit, and she wore them constantly, the heavy clomping sound of them on the floorboards a new and oddly comforting presence in the house. She had also claimed a corner of the cabin for herself, a small space by the hearth where she would sit in the evenings, her hands busy with some small, quiet task. It was her space, and he respected it, a silent acknowledgment of her right to exist within his walls. The blizzard arrived without warning, a sudden, violent assault of wind and snow that descended from the mountains like an avenging god. One moment the sky was a placid, indifferent gray. The next, the world outside the cabin window dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The wind shrieked, a high, thin sound of pure fury, rattling the window pane and probing at every chink in the log walls. Snow began to pile up in massive drifts, burying the fences and climbing the walls of the cabin, sealing them inside a cold, white tomb. For 3 days the storm raged, imprisoning Jacob and Ann Lee in the small, confined space. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the room, the flickering light of the fire, and the constant, deafening roar of the wind. The quiet routine they had established was broken, replaced by a forced and heavy stillness. Jacob spent hours staring into the fire, the flames a mesmerizing dance of destruction and creation. The storm outside mirrored the one he had carried inside himself for years, a relentless tempest of grief and rage that had scoured him clean of everything but the memory of his loss. In the close confines of the cabin, An Lee's presence was magnified. He was acutely aware of her every small movement, the soft sound of her breathing, the rustle of her mended dress. The silence between them, once a comfortable buffer, was now charged with an unspoken tension. There was nowhere to retreat, no physical labor to distract him from the proximity of this quiet, resilient stranger who had so thoroughly invaded his solitude. On the second night of the storm, the temperature plummeted. The cold was a physical entity, pressing in on them, leaching the warmth from the very air. Jacob fed the hearth relentlessly, the log walls groaning in protest against the assault. He found An Lee huddled in her corner, wrapped in a thin blanket, her body trembling not from fear, but from the penetrating chill. He saw in her a fragility that stirred the long-dormant protective instinct within him. He took the heavy bearskin from his own cot, the one that had kept him from freezing on the coldest nights, and walked over to her. He didn't speak. He simply draped the heavy fur over her small shoulders. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide in the firelight, reflecting the dancing flames. For a moment he thought she might refuse it, but she only pulled it tighter around herself, a silent acceptance of his gesture. He returned to his chair, the cold now biting at him more sharply, but he felt a different kind of warmth spread through his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that had nothing to do with the fire. Later that night, as the wind howled its most desolate song, he saw a glint of moisture on her cheek. A single tear escaped and traced a silent path through the grime on her skin. She was staring into the fire, but he knew she wasn't seeing the flames. She was seeing a memory, a loss as profound as his own. He felt an urge to speak, to ask, to offer some useless word of comfort, but he crushed it. He knew that some sorrows were too deep for words. Instead, he simply remained where he was, a silent guardian in the storm, his presence a quiet testament to the fact that she was no longer alone in the dark. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, it was to a world transformed. The wind died, leaving behind a silence so absolute it seemed to ring in the ears. Jacob opened the cabin door to a landscape of impossible, pristine beauty. The snow lay in deep, sculptural drifts, glittering under a weak sun that had finally broken through the clouds. Every sharp edge of the world had been softened, buried under a thick white blanket of peace. It was a lie, of course. Beneath the serene surface, the world was more treacherous than ever, the cold deeper, the dangers hidden. But for a moment, it looked like a fresh start, a clean slate. The shared ordeal inside the cabin had forged a subtle but significant shift in the space between them. The tension had eased, replaced by a quiet sense of mutual reliance. They had weathered the storm together, two solitary souls bound by the shared shelter of four walls. That afternoon, as he was clearing a path to the woodpile, she emerged from the cabin, bundled in her oversized boots and the heavy bearskin. She carried a steaming mug in her hands, which she held out to him. It was coffee, black and strong. He took it, his gloved fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact was like a spark in the frigid air. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, and slightly hoarse from disuse. The two simple words, the first she had ever spoken to him, struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had grown so accustomed to her silence that the sound of her voice was both a shock and a revelation. It was a melody he hadn't realized he had been missing. He could only nod in response, the words caught in his throat. He watched her retreat back to the cabin, the heavy bearskin trailing behind her in the snow. Later that day, a new sound filled the cabin. As she kneaded dough for the evening's bread, she began to hum. It was a low, melancholy tune, a melody filled with a deep and ancient sadness. Yet it was not without a thread of resilient hope. The song wound its way into the wooden walls, into the very fabric of the small space, and into the silent, guarded corners of Jacob's heart. He sat by the fire, pretending to clean his rifle, but he was listening to her song. It spoke of loss and longing, of a home left behind and a journey filled with hardship. It was her story, told in a language more profound than words. He found himself closing his eyes, letting the sad, beautiful music wash over him, a strange and bittersweet comfort. The cabin was no longer silent. It had been filled with the scent of baking bread, the sound of a soft, humming voice, and the fragile, burgeoning possibility of a life reclaimed from the ruins. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered a week later by the arrival of 3 riders. Jacob saw them from a distance, dark figures moving slowly against the snow-dazzled horizon. Strangers were a rarity, and almost always a threat. He felt the old, familiar instincts stir within him, the cold watchfulness of a man who had spent too much of his life looking over his shoulder. He moved back to the cabin, his hand resting instinctively on the hilt of the knife he always wore at his belt. Oneill saw the change in him and followed his gaze out the window. A flicker of fear, primal and raw, crossed her face before she masked it with her usual stoic calm. The men were rough, their faces chapped red by the wind, their eyes holding the mean, hungry look of scavengers. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, their gaze sweeping over the small homestead, assessing its value, its vulnerability. One of them, a big man with a greasy beard, caught sight of Oneill through the window. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well now," he called out, his voice a gravelly intrusion into the valley's silence. "Look what the blizzard blew in. Didn't know you had such fine company out here, old man." Jacob stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself between the men and the door. He did not reach for a weapon. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "State your business," he said, his voice low and even, yet carrying a chilling authority that made the men shift in their saddles. The bearded man chuckled, a humorless sound. "Just being neighborly. We're looking for supplies, maybe a hot meal, and a little entertainment." His eyes slid back to the window, his meaning unmistakable. The air grew thick and heavy. The quiet rancher was gone, and in his place stood someone else, a man forged in a harder, more violent fire. This was the man Jacob had tried to bury, the man he had fled from. He had built this isolated life to keep that man chained, but now, to protect the fragile peace he had found, he had to let him loose. "You'll find none of that here," Jacob said, his voice dropping even lower. "The trail you were on is back the way you came. I suggest you find it." The second man, younger and wirier, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the clean snow. "He's telling us to leave, boys. Don't think I like his tone." He started to swing his leg over the saddle, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. Jacob didn't move a muscle, but his focus narrowed entirely onto the younger man. "I wouldn't," he said softly. The words were not a threat. They were a simple statement of fact, a promise of swift and terrible consequences. There was something in his stillness, in the absolute certainty in his eyes, that gave the men pause. They were bullies, used to preying on the weak. They sensed, with the animal instinct of their kind, that this quiet man was not weak. The bearded leader held up a hand, stopping his companion. He stared at Jacob for a long, hard moment, trying to read the history in his weathered face. He saw the scars, the haunted look in his eyes, and understood that he was facing a man who had nothing left to lose, and was therefore the most dangerous man of all. "Just passing through," the leader grumbled, pulling on his reins. He shot one last, lingering look at the cabin before turning his horse. "Let's go." They rode away without another word, their presence dissolving back into the vast white landscape, leaving behind only their foul words and the churned, dirty snow. After the riders had disappeared over the ridge, a profound silence descended once more upon the valley. But it was a different kind of silence. It was heavy with the aftermath of the confrontation, tainted by the ugliness that had breached their walls. Jacob remained on the porch for a long time, his back to the door, staring out at the empty horizon. The adrenaline slowly seeped out of him, leaving him feeling hollowed out and weary. The cold, controlled man who had faced down the drifters retreated, and the grieving, broken man he was underneath resurfaced. He was ashamed. Ashamed that he had been forced to resurrect that part of himself, the part that spoke the language of violence. He had wanted Oneill to see him as a protector, but he feared she had only seen a killer. He finally turned and went back inside, the warmth of the cabin feeling like a judgment. Oneill was standing by the hearth, her back to him. He could not read her expression. He expected her to be packing her few meager belongings, to be fleeing from the man she had just seen, the darkness he carried within him. He sank into his chair, the weight of his past pressing down on him, a burden more crushing than any physical labor. "You should go," he said, his voice a rough rasp. "It's not safe for you here. That part of my life, sometimes it follows me." He waited for her to agree, to gather her things and walk back out into the snow, leaving him to his solitude once more. But she did not move. After a long moment, she turned to face him. Her expression was not one of fear. It was one of quiet, profound understanding. She walked over to him, and he saw that she held a small bowl of warm water and a clean rag. She knelt before him and gently took his hand. He hadn't even realized he was bleeding. A small, shallow cut across his knuckles, from where he had gripped the porch railing too tightly. Wordlessly, she began to clean the wound. Her touch was feather light, incredibly gentle. As she tended to the small injury, the dam of his silence, the one he had maintained for 2 long years, finally broke. "My wife," he began, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "Her name was Sarah, and we had a son, David." He spoke of the fever that had taken them both within a week of each other, of his helplessness as he watched the 2 brightest lights in his world flicker and die. He spoke of the man he was before, a lawman, a gunslinger, and the violence that had clung to him like a shroud, a violence he could not protect his family from. He had buried them, and then he had buried that man Jacob along with them, coming to this remote valley to let the rest of him wither and fade. When he finished, the cabin was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. He felt raw, exposed, as if he had peeled back his own skin. Oneill finished tying a strip of clean cloth around his hand. She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own. "They took my family," she whispered, her own story a painful echo of his. "In my home, across the ocean. Then they sold me. I ran. I have been running for a long time." Their shared confessions hung in the air between them, 2 immense and heavy weights. But in their sharing, the burden was somehow lessened. They were no longer just a man and a girl from different worlds, but 2 survivors, 2 broken souls who had found in each other a quiet harbor in the storm. The harsh grip of winter began to loosen its hold on the valley. The change was subtle at first. The sun felt a fraction warmer on the skin, the days stretched a few minutes longer, and the relentless wind seemed to lose some of its biting edge. Icicles that had clung to the eaves of the cabin for months began to weep, their slow, steady drips a rhythmic countdown to the coming thaw. Patches of dark, damp earth began to appear on the south-facing slopes, stark against the receding snow. A sense of awakening, of life stirring from a long and deep slumber, permeated the air. Inside the cabin, a similar thaw was taking place. The shared confessions had irrevocably altered the dynamic between Jacob and Oneill. The vast, silent spaces between them were now filled with a new, unspoken intimacy. They still spoke little, but their silences were no longer born of caution or unfamiliarity. They were comfortable, companionable. He found himself watching her more, not with suspicion, but with a growing sense of wonder. He watched the way the pale morning light caught the black sheen of her hair as she braided it, the intense focus in her eyes as she ground herbs with a stone, the small, secret smile that touched her lips when she tasted a broth and found it to her liking. He was relearning the landscape of another person's presence, the quiet beauty of a shared existence. One afternoon he returned from checking his traps to find she was not in the cabin. A moment of pure, cold panic seized him. He thought she had finally left, that the threat of the riders had been too much. But then he saw her, standing near the edge of the newly thawed creek, her face tilted up to the weak sun. She had taken off the heavy, oversized boots and was standing barefoot on a patch of mossy ground, her toes curled into the living earth as if drawing strength from it. She was no longer just the ghost who had appeared in the snow. She was a woman, resilient and strong, who was, like the land around them, coming back to life. He walked over and stood beside her, his own heavy boots suddenly feeling clumsy and restrictive. They stood in silence for a long time, listening to the gurgle of the creek and the distant call of a returning songbird. The crude wooden sign he had hammered into the ground, the one that said, "Cook needed," had long since been buried by the winter drifts, its purpose made obsolete. He had needed a cook, but what he had found was something infinitely more precious, a reason to face the sunrise again. This quiet, steadfast woman had walked into the frozen wasteland of his life and had, with her quiet acts of care and her resilient spirit, coaxed a spring out of the permafrost of his heart. The world was slowly being reborn in hues of green and brown. The last remnants of snow clung stubbornly to the shaded hollows, but the valley floor was alive with the tender shoots of new grass. The air was soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of wildflowers. The creek, once a frozen ribbon of ice, now rushed and tumbled over its rocky bed, its voice a boisterous celebration of its freedom. The mountains, which had been his jailers all winter, now seemed like benevolent guardians, their stony faces softened by the spring light. Jacob found he was working with a different purpose now. He was not just surviving, he was building. He repaired the section of the barn roof that had been damaged by the heavy snow, his hammer blows ringing out with a clear, decisive rhythm. He tilled a small patch of ground near the cabin for a garden, turning over the rich, dark soil, preparing it for the seeds An Lee had carefully saved and stored. He worked, not as a man serving a life sentence, but as a man preparing a future. An Lee, too, seemed to blossom in the returning warmth. A touch of color returned to her cheeks, and the haunted, weary look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a quiet serenity. She moved about the homestead with a sense of belonging, her bare feet, now calloused and tough, seeming to prefer the feel of the earth to the confinement of the boots. She planted the seeds in the garden with the careful, knowing hands of someone who understood the cycles of life, of planting and nurturing and harvesting. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that reminded Jacob of her tattered dress, he found her sitting on the porch steps, watching the colors fade. He came and sat beside her, the wood of the steps still warm from the day's sun. A comfortable silence settled between them, a silence that was now their most familiar language. He looked at her, at the strong, delicate line of her jaw, the quiet grace of her posture. He thought of the first day he had seen her, a ghost of a girl barefoot in the snow, and the woman she was now, a vibrant, essential part of his world. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not imagine this place without her. He reached out and tentatively took her hand. Her fingers were small and cool against his calloused palm. She did not pull away. Instead, her fingers curled slightly, a silent response, an acceptance. It was a simple gesture, yet it held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, a promise of a shared future. He held her hand as darkness fell over the valley, the first stars beginning to prick the deep velvet of the sky. The ranch was no longer a place of exile, a monument to his grief. It was a home, and it was theirs. If you were moved by the story of two lost souls finding their way back to life, and you believe in the power of quiet strength and second chances, then consider subscribing to our channel. We are dedicated to telling stories that find the light in the darkness and the hope that can bloom in the harshest of winters. Join our community for more inspirational tales of love and resilience.